So chapter 4. This is a short chapter. However, I will say this, based on some feedback from people who have recently taken the exam, the state exam, I was relatively surprised to hear from them how many questions they said came from this chapter. Honestly, it's a very short chapter. I would have been surprised at more than 1 or 2 questions from it. The last lady we had take the exam said that there were about 5 questions from this chapter. And so I'm very surprised at that. So it's a short chapter, but it's a chapter you really need to get sort of hammered down because it does sound like they give you quite a number of questions from it. Okay? The good news for you is there is not a lot that's hard in this chapter. Now, the one thing in this chapter that we will go into that is traditionally tough for a lot of people is acreage math. Conversion of acreage to square footage and square footage to acreage and figuring out lot sizes and how many lots you can develop. We will work through that. So there's going to be some math challenges. I don't know if you looked at that math sheet I gave you the other night, the one we worked on in class, and saw that that was the next thing in there. We will work on that tonight. I hope you brought those back. If not, I'll make some more copies. But we will get to acreage math tonight. And that's probably the hardest part of this chapter, is the math. All right? Well, not probably. It definitely is the hardest part of this chapter. All right. So this chapter is all about how do we legally describe a piece of land. That is very important because we're going to be writing contracts for sale on these pieces of property. Contracts for lease, for that matter. And it's kind of important to be able to describe the property you're actually selling. Right? Would you not agree with that? To know for sure that the property that's being conveyed is the one you want to convey. And so you need to learn how we legally describe a piece of property, because we don't describe it as that one over there. That doesn't work very well in contract settings. We have to have a language all its own to tell us what properties we're dealing with. We say the legal description is the exact location of the parcel according to some established system. And we have an established system that we use in North Carolina. It's called meets and bounds. We'll talk about it in detail in a second. There are other systems in other parts of the country, or there's another system, I should say, because there's really only 2. We used to not teach you the system that we don't use in North Carolina because obviously you get a North Carolina license and it doesn't benefit you much to know how they describe property in other states. But now, since you have to take a national licensing exam, you have to learn how to describe property in all 50 states. And so you're going to actually get 2 methods of property description in this chapter, not just one. We say that any description of property is sufficient if a licensed surveyor can locate it with that description. So if a surveyor can locate the property, then we say it's sufficient. All right? The ways that we can describe real estate are many. Even though there's only 2 real systems of describing real estate, we sometimes take shortcuts as brokers, particularly. Because the systems, especially the one we use in North Carolina, you're going to find in just a minute, is not very user-friendly. It's very old. Hundreds of years old. Many of the property descriptions in North Carolina are hundreds of years old. And that becomes a little bit unwieldy when you're trying to deal with it. So we're going to talk about that system, but we're also going to talk about shortcuts to that system. And we will tell you when, and I'll tell you when it's appropriate to use the shortcuts and when it's not appropriate to use the shortcuts. So let's talk about the original system of measuring and describing land. It's called meets and bounds. And this is the system that we use in North Carolina. Now, if you look, the first thing it says is it's the primary legal description where? In the original 13 colonies. What does that tell you about its origins? Where does it probably come from? England. England, exactly. This is a direct descendant of English common law. This is exactly how property is described in the United Kingdom still today. And we still use it here in North Carolina, as well as the other of the original 13 colonies, still uses the meets and bounds set of property description. It ain't easy to deal with. I will tell you that. If you don't know what you're looking at, it's ridiculously confusing. If you do know what you look at, it's only mildly confusing. The best way to think about a meets and bounds description, though, is to realize that it's really old. So, if you took somebody from 500 years ago, I'm just using a round number, and you put them out in the middle of a field somewhere, because that's the only thing that would be here 500 years ago, and you said, I want you to show me where this piece of property is. What do you think that person would have to do? I mean, how are they going to show you where the property boundaries are?
Walk it.
They're going to walk it. And that's exactly what a meets and bounds property description is. It's, here's a starting point, here's how far you walk, and here's the direction you walk in. And when you get there, we'll tell you where else to go. And so eventually, where are you going to end up back at? The same place you started. You're going to come in a big circle. Because the only way they had to describe property hundreds of years ago was to walk it, to walk the boundaries off. And so that's what a meets and bounds description is. It's let's describe a place for you to start, and then we'll tell you which direction to go in and how far you go that way. And when you get to that point, you stop and you read further. And you go this direction for this many feet. And then you stop and you turn this direction for this many feet. That's a meets and bounds property description. Now, we have refined it to be much more accurate because we have surveyors' tools and lasers and all that sort of thing. One of the inherent problems with meets and bounds has always been it wasn't the most accurate thing in the world. The other major problem with meets and bounds property descriptions is this point of beginning, this place where we started. Well, 500 years ago, what kinds of things would you have used to describe this is where you start? A rock. Yeah. What else?
Large tree.
A big tree. Yeah. A river, a creek, a ditch. What happens to trees over the course of 500 years? They die, they fall, they get cut down. How about rocks? They get moved, right? So there's lots of room for error when you're looking at original meets and bounds descriptions. Now, obviously, we use much more sophisticated tools now. But this was the inherent problem with the meets and bounds property description. The other big problem for the United States early in its existence with the meets and bounds method of property description was that the only way you could survey this land was if you were actually there. And if you think back to your American history, they knew there was a lot of stuff that way, west, but they didn't know how much was there. They didn't know how far that went, and they certainly had never been there to survey it off. So that was why meets and bounds didn't stay the primary way to measure properties in expanded states. They came up with a different system. Does that make sense why a different system kind of came into play? By the way, that different system came from Thomas Jefferson, like most of the best ideas in the founding of our country. He created the government rectangular survey, which we're going to talk about in just a second. But meets and bounds is still the way we describe property in North Carolina. We do have a point of beginning, and we have what they call them calls. You don't need to know that. You won't be tested on it. But what you may need to know is that meets means distance and bounds means direction. So those are two words to remember when it comes to meets and bounds, is what those mean. The meet is the distance you walk, so 150 feet in this direction. The bounds is the direction, north, south, west, 180 degrees. You know, it will tell you a direction on the compass. It's a compass direction, which way you're going to be walking. All right? Shortcuts to the meets and bounds. the reference to a recorded plat map. So, now let's talk about how we subdivide property. Meets and bounds works fine when you're dealing with huge pieces of property, farms, right? Big, large tracts of land. Because that was the best way to describe a big, large tract of land, was to describe the perimeter of it. Well, when you start subdividing land, it becomes really unwieldy to have. Just to give you an idea, look on page, give you a meets and bounds description here. Look on page 65 in your textbook. Second paragraph down. That is a meets and bounds description for that little tiny tract of land that you see in that diagram. A tract of land located in blank, and it would be the county name, described as follows. Beginning at the intersection of the east line of Jones Road and the south line of Skull Drive. That's your point of beginning. That's where you start. Thence north. We say words like thence a lot now, don't we? It sounds like Shakespeare wrote the thing because it's Old English. Thence north 90 degrees east along the south line of Skull Drive 200 feet. Thence south 15 degrees east 216.5 feet, more or less, to the center thread of Red Skull Creek. Thence north 4 degrees west along the center line of said creek to its intersection with the east line of Jones Road. Thence north 105 feet more or less along the east line of Jones Road to the place of beginning. So you see they just took you in a circle around that piece of property, right? Can you imagine, remember, you, real estate agent, you have to write contracts to sell this mess. Can you imagine if you had to write that word for word as a property description on a sales contract? Number one, how many typos would get put in there? It would be brutal how much that would get screwed up, right? So we found an easier way that is very appropriate for us to use as real estate brokers. We call it the reference to a recorded plat map. When we subdivide land, and a subdivision is just division into two or more pieces. You take one piece and you turn it into two, that's creation of a subdivision. Anytime you do that, you've got to file and record what's known as a plat map with the county. And you might as well go ahead and get used to that terminology. We're going to see it multiple times throughout the rest of the class. A plat map is just a drawing by a surveyor of a subdivision. Okay? Show you what a plat map might look like. Look on page 70 in your textbook. That diagram on page 70 is a good example of a plat map. See, here's how this helps us and how this is a tremendous shortcut. When a surveyor creates a map of this subdivision, they have to create this long meets and bounds description for every one of these lots. And they have to put that long meets and bounds description on this plat map. Somewhere on this plat map is going to be a meets and bounds description for every one of these lots. Y'all following me so far? Mm-hmm. Here's the beauty of that. That plat map, where's it going to be recorded? At the county courthouse. That's public information, right? So us as real estate agents, instead of having to, if we're selling one of these lots on here, instead of having to give that beginning at the intersection of this and thence this many feet and that way, and instead of doing that, we say, go look at the book of maps, page 500, lot number 3. That's what we're selling. You see how that's a big time shortcut for us in the contract process. Because when you refer to this plat map, aren't you referring to that big long definition of the thing? Because anybody who wanted to see that full meets and bounds description, they could go down to the Wake County Courthouse, pull out the book of maps, look on page 500, and there it would be. Lot number 3, here's the meets and bounds description. We got it. So it saves us from having to put that on a contract.
Is it the same thing as going to, what's the website? Like you can see, you can type in people's names, see where their address is.
That's a property tax record card.
But then you map it out. And it shows up, like, the map shows up, and you can see, like, there's, I forget what it is. but-
It's called IMAPs. It's the way you run the way
Yeah.
county system is called
Yeah.
IMAPs. I know exactly what you're talking about.
But-
Not the same as a plat map.
It's not.
Because
There's a
that,
bunch of
because
numbers
I,
on there.
yes, because it does have the
Zoning.
information there.
Yeah,
But what you have to remember is IMAPs has every property in the county. Whereas plat maps are specific to a subdivision.
okay.
Okay? And please, since I've introduced that word, subdivision. A subdivision is not a place you turn into off the road with a sign at the damn highway that says Happy Acres. That ain't a subdivision. It might well be a subdivision, but it's probably 10 or 12 subdivisions within one. The definition of a subdivision, folks, is any division of land, okay? How many of you live in a subdivision? How many houses are in your subdivision? Roughly.
Few streets.
A few streets. I guarantee you it's more than one subdivision. I bet you any amount of money I have right now, it is more than one subdivision. They may call it all the same thing. And it may be Happy Acres Phase 1, and Happy Acres Phase 2, and Happy Acres Phase 3, and Happy Acres Phase 4, but those are all different subdivisions. So you have to get out of this mindset of just because there's one sign and it's one HOA, it's not one subdivision. Because in the eyes of the law, every time there's a plat map, that's a subdivision. And when we get to the subdivision rules, you'll understand why developers would want to do it that way. There's a disadvantage to trying to file a plat map for 400 lots at one time. Because once you file it, you're locked into it. You can't make changes to it. It's hard to lock in and know what you're going to do with that many lots before you start doing it. So they tend to do it in small batches and small numbers, so that's how you get different phases. How many of you ever been to a new home construction site and they say, you know, this is phase 3, this is phase 4. What it really means is that's a different subdivision. That's what it really means, legally anyway.
So if they're, I mean, I've never heard the phase thing, but like I live in an area where there's a couple townhome buildings and then single-family homes. They all look the same. Would they be different subdivisions?
Most likely. Particularly if they're a
Like
town.
building, so like each different building might be a different subdivision?
No, probably not each building, but if you've got single family and townhomes,
So like the single family would be one and then,
and it may be more than one.
yeah,
It may, even the single family may be more than one.
yeah.
You know, even the townhouses may be more than one, depending on how many townhouse buildings there were. Say if I've got 10 buildings, well, I probably don't want to file a plat map with all 10 of them on there, because I may want to make a change. I may build the first 2 buildings and find out that I didn't leave enough space in the front yard. People can't park. We can't sell them because the driveways are too short. Well, if I filed the plat map for the whole thing, I'm stuck building the other 8 that same way, because I've already locked it in. Does that make sense to everybody? Whereas if I file a plat map that's only got the first 2 buildings on it, and I build those 2 and I decide, oh no, we need to change this, I haven't filed a new plat map for the next phase, so I can do that at that time and I can make a change. And so developers do that all the time. All right? Because you can't change plat maps like that once you've started. All right? So does everybody understand this reference to a recorded plat map, what we're doing? We're just simply saying, go find this plat map in the book of maps. We're selling lot number 3 on that map, for example. This is a big shortcut for us. Okay? And it says here, this is the most common and worry-free method for urban property. Why urban property? When do you file a plat map? When you do what? Before you build. When you subdivide. When you subdivide. You file a plat map when you subdivide land. Which land has been subdivided more often? Rural land or urban land? Urban land. So that's why this is the most common method for urban land. It's actually the most common method everywhere now, because most properties have been subdivided many, many times over the years. Occasionally, you go out in very rural parts of the state, you'll find farms that the only description they have is still a meets and bounds description. And so if you were writing a contract for that, you'd have to put the entire meets and bounds description. My family farm in Edgecombe County only has a meets and bounds description. It's been in my family since 1787. And it only has a meets and bounds description, and that thing is 4 pages long. So if you want to sell that far, all 4 pages of that has to be in the property description, because that is the only legal description of it. Okay? Right? We can also take a shortcut by referring to a previously recorded deed. Who knows what a deed is? Or think you know what a deed is, anyway? Nobody?
It's like a title to a house.
See, and not picking on you at all. I'm really not. That's the answer I wanted you to say, because it's the wrong answer. All right? Deeds are not like titles to houses. Deeds are like receipts for buying a house. It's proof that somebody transferred that property into your name. Because that's what it does. It transfers title. A deed is the document we use that legally transfers ownership from grantor to grantee. Okay? We record those deeds as public evidence that transfer has happened. We go to the county courthouse and we record a deed because we want to show to the world that Tang doesn't own this property anymore, that Jermaine does. Does that make sense? Whose best interest would it be to record that thing? Now, this is not part of the chapter, but I want to get your brains working a little bit. Whose best interest is it to go to the county courthouse and record that thing? Tang's or Jermaine's? The buyer or the seller? Absolutely. The seller gains no advantage by advertising to the world that they don't own the thing anymore, but the buyer has every interest in making sure that the world knows that they have, and that's the purpose of recording, right? Is to give notice to the world. That's why we do it. That's why we do it. That's why we record. So, when we go record this deed, guess what the deed has to have on it? If the deed is the thing that transfers ownership from Tang to Jermaine, what do you think the deed has to have on it relating to the property? A description. It's got to have a description on it. Guess what description it's going to have? It's going to have in North Carolina, it's going to have a meets and bounds description on it. So another shortcut that we can use as real estate brokers is to refer to the previously recorded deed. If Tang is selling the property to Jermaine, we could write the contract and say, in the property description section, we could say, go to the Register of Deeds office, pull out book number 550, go to page 387, the property that's mentioned on that deed is the property we're selling. Does that make sense? So the same way we can refer to a plat map, we can also refer to the last deed that was recorded. Now, here's the reason we don't like to do this on anything other than a contract. We would never do this on a deed itself. Because we don't want one deed referring to another deed, referring to another deed. You just keep going. It's like a endless cycle, right? You know, you look for the property description, it says, see this deed on this page, and you pull up that deed, and it says, see this deed on this page, and you pull up that deed, and it says, see this deed on this page, and then you get the next one, and it's missing from 80 years ago. You have no idea what property you have, right? So we always want every deed to have that meets and bounds property description, so that we don't have that broken chain. We want to see what the property is. Is everybody okay on that? Do you understand the difference between referring to the plat map and referring to a deed? Sort of. We good on that? Okay. All right. Informal references. These are not going to be used for sales contracts. Street addresses. Yes, we do put the street address on the contract. The reason for that is so everybody can find the thing when they're driving, not because that's how we're describing the property. We want a legal description on there as well. So this is not sufficient on a contract. It is, however, most often used in leases. Leases usually only have the street address on them. Now let's talk about the other system. The government rectangular survey. So this is used in states other than the original 13 colonies. Again, created by Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson's idea was to create a system where you could survey land without being there. You could actually map it out and survey it and measure it off without ever having been there. And so the way he did that was to say, what if we just created a series of grid lines where every line was the same distance apart? So what we're creating is a series of boxes, squares, right? And every square is exactly the same size. How many of you ever flown across the Midwest? You ever look down, see what you see? What does it look like? A bunch of squares. A bunch of rectangles. Everything's rectangular, right? You go in every city and the streets and the blocks are perfect rectangles. Everybody's yard is a perfect rectangle. Every farm is a perfect rectangle. That's because of the government rectangular survey. It was a system to measure and draw off land without ever having been there. You knew that that was going to be the measurement before you ever even got there, because the country was expanding so quickly westward that they didn't have time to survey it as they went.
Why do you think it's not used here?
Just because it's very hard to come back and describe our pieces of property, which are very irregularly shaped, with a rectangular system. So, our pieces of property, because the original borders were creeks and streams and rivers and trees and, everything else, have very jagged and ridiculous borders in a lot of cases. So it's very hard to come back and apply a rectangular system to that. So that's why, the states that originally used meets and bounds have just stuck with it. Yeah. All right. It's also why our roads go in circles. We don't have rectangular, gridded off streets here. That you don't think of that when you grow up in North Carolina, but people that come here, one of the first things they say is like, how the hell did I just cross that same street 3 times? I don't understand how that just happened, right? Like, drive Maynard Road in Cary, and you're like, wait, there's Cary Parkway. I thought that was Cary Park. Wait a minute, there's Cary Parkway. How's that happen? What just happened? And that doesn't happen in the Midwest. It's an entirely Eastern Coast thing, and it's because we don't use the government rectangular survey. So it is the most common method used in the majority of states. So, things you need to know, and it's in your book beginning on page 65 at the bottom, but really 66, 67. And these are the states that use the government rectangular survey. Obviously, most of the rest of the country does. There are some terminologies that you need to know. And then there's some minor math that you need to know for the government rectangular survey. Every rectangular survey map has this intersection. You'll see bolded lines and they intersect, and that's called the point of beginning. That's where you start looking at the map. Okay? So you start wherever this intersection is. The lines that run from the top of the page to the bottom of the page, so the vertical lines, are called range lines. The vertical lines from top of the page to bottom of the page, so from here to here, running this way, are called range lines. It is extremely complex to read one of these things. You start at the middle, and if you go to the east, the first line is range 1 east. The second line is range 2 east. The third line is range 3 east. If you can do that, you can read a government rectangular survey. It really is that simple. So those are the range lines. We also have what we call township lines. Those are the horizontal or east-west lines. Township lines. And each one of these perfect squares that we have created is called a township. So every one of these perfect boxes right here is called a township. And they're all exactly the same size. that size you need to know. Okay? So in your notes, I want you to put townships are 6 by 6 miles. 6 miles wide, 6 miles tall. So how many square miles is that? 36. Township is 36 square miles. That also means that each one of these lines is 6 miles apart, right? If you go east to west, the lines are 6 miles apart. If you go north to south, the lines are 6 miles apart. That's how every box gets to be 6 by 6. As far as naming the townships and reading them on the map, you start at the point of beginning, where that intersection line is, and it says here, Township 2 North, Range 3 East, or 2N 3E. Start here, and you go, how many north? 2. 1, 2. And then where are we going?
East.
3 east. 1, 2, 3. And so whichever one you've hit, 1, 2 north, 1, 2, 3 east, that is Township 2N 3E. Now, in today's world, that probably has a name. It might be, Garner Township, or it's got some name now. When this was created, there were no names, because these places had never even been seen. They were mapped without being seen. Okay? Is everybody good on this screen? You know what a township line is? You know what a range line is? How big is each one of these townships? 36 square miles. Not feet, miles. Big. 6 miles by 6 miles. And every township's the same. So here's how the government rectangular survey works. Obviously, people don't buy 6 mile by 6 mile square blocks of land, right? That's a lot of land. So the rest of this stuff is just a way to break down that box into a smaller box. That's all we're accomplishing with the government rectangular survey. It's find your right township on the map, and now we're going to start breaking down that township into smaller boxes until we find our piece of land. With me? All right. Townships are broken into 36 sections. How many square miles did I say there was in a township? 36. And how many sections are there in a township? 36. And so, how big do you think a section is?
640.
1 square mile. Every section is 1 square mile. Mile wide, a mile tall. 36 square miles in a township, 36 sections in a township. Every section is 1 square mile. Now here's the big number. This is you write it down, you memorize it, you get it tattooed on the back of your arm so you don't forget it on the exam number. 1 square mile is equal to 640 acres. So each section is how many acres? 640. Each section is 640 acres. You don't need to know anything on this screen other than these are some of the more common sizes. Don't worry about taking any notes about anything in here because you won't get it. You won't have to define any of those things. But this just shows an example of how a section can be broken down. So think of, how many of you use like Google Earth on your computer? Like you put an address in, when you first pull it up, you get a view of the whole globe sitting there spinning, right? And you put an address in, and what does it do? Just zooms in. That's the same thing we're doing with the government rectangular survey. We're taking this big map and we're saying, first let's find the township. Okay, well we've narrowed it down. The property is somewhere in this 36 square miles, right? And so the next part of the description is going to be, okay, well, Give me a number. Which one of these sections within that 36 square miles? Does that make sense? So we've gone from big picture here, it's somewhere in there, to now we've blown up that one section and said, okay, where in that section is it? It's in, where in that township is it? It's in section 22. So now, what do you think we're going to do? We're going to zoom in on section 22. And that's what this looks like. That's zooming in on, so we've zoomed in on a township first. Then we've zoomed in on and found a section. Now we've zoomed inside that section, and we're going to find out where in that section this property is located. Because now we've got it narrowed down pretty well. We're only down to 640 acres at this point. So now we can start to sort of say, it's in this corner of that 640. Does that make sense? So that's what we're doing with the government rectangular survey. All right, let me take that off there. I'm going to write a government rectangular survey description up here on the screen, on the, the board, and show you what one looks like. Let me write it bigger than that so you can write this down so you can follow it. So it said, this is how you would read that. This is actually what the property description looks like. Remember, we've gone from meets and bounds where it's start here and go thence this far and that far and more or less 80 feet and to this. A lot shorter, right? And it's always the same. It's always some mixture of these directions and quarters or halves. That's it. Here's how you read it. The property is the northern half of the southwest quarter of the southern half of the eastern half of the northeast quarter of section 18. I don't even care if you know what that means, because I guarantee you I can show you how to do it. I'm going to go over to the other board over here and show you. Here's the key to reading a government rectangular survey. Read backwards. Normally you read left to right, don't you? Government rectangular survey, you're going to go the opposite direction. What's on the far right in this thing?
Section 18.
Section 18. So that's the first thing we're going to zoom in on. And how big is section 18?
640 acres.
640 acres, right? We know that because every section is 640 acres, right? So what's the next thing back from section 18? The northeast quarter. So, imagine ourselves in the middle. Which way's north? This way. Which way's east? This way. So, a quarter would be like that, right? So what we know now is that none of this matters. Because our piece of land that we're looking for is somewhere in here, right? So now it's time to zoom in one more step. What's the next step? The eastern half. Well, again, starting in the middle of the space we're working on. Which way's east? To the right. To the right. So what we know is we're somewhere over here, right? So this is gone now. What's our next zoom in? The southern half. Again, we're working in this section. Which way is south? So, we're somewhere in here, right? That means this is gone. And what else? The southwest quarter. So, south down, west this way, somewhere in here, right? That means all that's gone. But the last thing I can't see over there. The northern half. So again here, northern half, Get rid of that. There's our property. Right there. Here's the other really simple thing about the government rectangular survey. Not only can you find it on a map from reading that thing, could you find a property in North Carolina on a map based on reading the meets and bounds description? No. No way. So, number one, this automatically gives you a leg up. You can find the property on a map using the property description, right? How would you have to figure out how many acres were in a property in North Carolina using the meets and bounds description? Walk it, calculate it, survey it. Whole lot of work, right? How big did we say we started with here? 640 acres, right? Read with me again from right to left. What's the first thing we did? The northeast what? Quarter. Can't we take a quarter of 640?
Yeah.
640 divided by what? That's how much? 160 acres. Well, that was this section, right? That piece. Did we divide it some more?
Mm-hmm.
What did we divide it by next time?
Half.
The eastern half, right? So we can divide that 160, divide it in half. That left us with 80 acres. You see a trend?
Mm-hmm.
What's the next one? Another half, right? So we can divide 80 by 2. Takes us down to 40 acres. How about now? Quarter. Are we back to a quarter? That southwest quarter. So 40 divided by 4 equals 10. And we got one more. What is it?
Half.
It's a half. So 10 divided by 2. How big is our piece of land? So just by reading that, we can find it on the map, and we know exactly how big it is before we ever even see it. Thomas Jefferson's pretty smart, isn't he? Does this make sense to you now? See how it works? Here's the great thing. From test purposes, if they give you this and ask you how big it is, no matter what this string says, all you got to do is punch in 640 in your calculator and hit divided by 4, divided by 2, divided by 2, divided by 4, divided by 2. And every single time you can calculate the size of that piece of land. You just 640 and you divide by the denominators all the way across. Is anybody lost with that? We're good. All right,
So
let's
don't
take,
multiply it, just divide it.
just divide. 640 and you start dividing the denominator all the way across.
But you can take the denominators and multiply them and then take 640.
Same thing. Yeah, same math operation. If you wanted to multiply those together and then divide that into 640, it's the same number of keystrokes. Whatever works better for you. Okay? We good on government rectangular survey? How big is a township? 36 square miles. How many sections in a township? 36. How big is each section? 1 square mile, which is also what? 640 acres. That's it. You just learned a government rectangular survey. You could be a surveyor in Minnesota. You're qualified. All right, let's take a break.